Hey everyone, it's Nightlight9, and in this video I want to go over buffs and debuffs. With all of the content in the game becoming harder, or at least being the main sticking point, being the hard content in the game, and the new banners coming out with all these different weapons and people making all these pulls and wondering what to wishlist for, I figured this would be a great time to go over this. It's been a video, or a topic for a video, that I've been wanting to go through for quite a while now, and I actually did some tests about a week and a half ago, but now's the time to finally get to go through it all. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the strength of buffs versus debuffs. And primarily, I would say that debuffs are stronger than buffs. Why do I say that? One, because in a lot of the high difficulty content, there's usually one boss, especially, when we're thinking about EX events or crash events, a lot of times there's one boss. Debuffing that one boss is way more efficient than trying to buff multiple teammates. Now, additionally, the debuffs are stronger, I think, because even if you're trying to just do more damage to a boss, the fact that the boss's stats, I think a lot of times are going to be higher than that of our own, means that a debuff to his stats are going to be more effective, because the higher the stat you're decreasing or increasing, the more effective that decrease or increase as a percentage is going to be. So, when we think about debuffs, I definitely think they are stronger. The weaknesses of debuffs are that there are plenty of bosses that are randomly immune to certain debuffs, where this is where buffs shine, because there is no ability in the game at the moment that prevents your party from being able to cast buffs on yourself. Now, there are debuffs that the enemies have, but at the end of the day, buffs are always going to be useful. The other thing I wanted to point out with debuffs is that a lot of times enemies, one of the mechanics that makes them strong is they will buff themselves. And typically, they buff themselves way more than high potency. Usually they're going to have 4 or 5 arrows going up. And so the potency is going to be huge. We can't possibly buff ourselves enough to compensate for that. But we can debuff them down, and because of the way the stacking works, which, if you don't know, I did previously put out a video about how buffs and debuffs kind of stack against each other up to a certain threshold based on the ability description. But, we can keep chipping them down. And so I think it is easy to say that debuffs are stronger, buffs are going to be more consistently usable. I've broken this down into just kind of 3 different characters' weapons. We've got Aerith, we've got Tifa, we've got Red 13. And if you watch any of my other videos, you all know that I am a big fan of Tifa. Why? Well, because I know that debuffs are stronger than buffs. So anytime I have an opportunity to use debuffing against an enemy, I know I'm going to be able to clear harder content with lower overall power. And what are the 2 biggest weapons? Well, for one, leather gloves, which I just got and did not have for a long time, but Omni Strike here not only is going to do the physical damage when you're using it, but lower physical attack at a mid potency, stacking up to high for 22 seconds. Definitely a good debuff. The counterpart to that is Tiger Fangs. Upper shot here, we can see, again, you're doing damage when you use it, and also decreasing magic attack, potency mid, max potency high, duration here 20 seconds. Those 2 are so interchangeable because a lot of the times enemies either do one or the other. They either specialize in physical attack or they specialize in magical attack. And so that is the biggest reason that I use Tifa. Red 13 also has a lot of debuffs. I don't use him as much, but he is also, I would say, if you have a lot of things for him and not Tifa, you can use him as well. Just to give an example, this Iron Collar here, which was a free weapon, I mean, it's got a physical defense decrease. That helps do damage, right? There are plenty of weapons that you can use, but I also want to look at the buffs really quick. And the Chocobo Staff here with Solid Mana Ward, mid-potency magic defense increase, that's good. It's definitely good. The problem is, for this one, is single ally. So if the boss isn't telegraphing a move towards a specific ally, a lot of times, I mean, it's expensive to cast this at 4. But with all of that being said, I also want to caution people against buffs in one respect. Your buffs should be adding to and complementing your team. And the specific examples that I'm going to use for this video is first a good example, which is Chocobo Staff. We have Solid Mana Ward here, which increases magic defense, mid potency, stacks to high. The one thing that this is good for is it complements what my Aerith is already doing. If she's set up for healing, then you can also say in the same token she is also set up for overall team survivability. So even though I have to spend 4 ATB to cast this, instead of say, trying to cast a Curaga, well, if I buff the magic defense of a party member, they will take less damage from magic attacks, which ultimately is going to help Aerith have to heal less. So it complements her in that survivability role. Now, on the flip side of that, I want to look at Aonibi here with Sephiroth, because it's the most comparable weapon that I can find or think of, and it's very similar to the current banner weapon that we have. So we're going to go to Aonibi here. And the ability on this is Frenzied Stance. Magic attack is increased, potency mid, max potency high, and if you get it leveled up enough, it will, at OB6, start off at potency high. A lot of people who are, light spenders, free to play, it's going to take a while, I imagine, before you get a weapon like this to OB6. But into the reason I really want to look at this, you would think that this is very complementary for an attack build, similar to how Solid Mana Ward is for survivability. However, I'm going to show you some tests that show that it's actually not. And it's really disappointing, but I think the buff is just not strong enough to make it worth spending 4 ATB over. And the reason is because obviously everybody's excited, Sephiroth is a magic attack user, and the ability on Aonibi, Frenzied Stance, seems like it would pair perfectly with that. I'm going to show you my Sephiroth here. We're looking at about 3,000 magic attack, briefly show you my equipment, and what we're going to be doing in these tests are using ice damage, both against an enemy that is weak to ice and one that is not. We'll start with one that is not weak to ice first. And I just kind of want to show you what the difference is, and then I will run through the calculations and explain the final result. So here we can see we've got Frenzied Stance on. We just did 7,006 damage, and we're going to be casting it again, and we will hit 7,143. And last we will, well, actually we're going to get 2 more attacks off. So one of the things to know is that if you cast this buff where I have it, you get about 40 seconds, and that is enough to, if conditions are ideal, to get 4 attacks off before the buff runs out. And that's assuming that you had your gauge charged and you had enough ATB to kind of immediately use it, or use it as soon as possible after casting the buff. Now there, that last one, it wasn't good, so we're not going to count that one. But here we are now attacking without the buff, a separate run. And you can see we're doing, 5,800, 6,000, about 11 to 1,200 damage less per hit. And that's going to be, it seems significant when you see that damage. But if we look at the numbers with the buff, and I threw out any irregular damage numbers, we had 3 solid numbers here. 7,006, 7,143, and 7,199. That gives us a total of 21,348. And if we take those numbers, add them up, divide it by 3 to give our average damage per attack, we have 7,111 damage per attack, and then we multiply that by 4, assuming we would have gotten the ideal number of attacks with the buff, we'd have 28,464 total damage. If we come over and do the same exact calculations, but this time with the damage numbers from not being buffed, then we are left with 29,493 damage. Looking at these numbers side by side, we can see that we actually did a little bit more than 1,000 extra damage in the same period of time without the buff. Now, for the sake of being thorough, and because I was in total disbelief at the results of the previous test, I decided to run the test one more time against an enemy who was weak to ice. And this is the exact same setup. The only thing that's changed is the boss that I'm going against. And you can see here that with the Frenzied Stance bonus, we're doing 27,200, 27,485, and this last hit is 27,542. So, pretty solid numbers. Those look pretty big. Now we're doing the test without the buff, and we are hitting for 22,600. And the next one, I believe, will be 22,424 here. So we can see that we're doing about 5,000 less damage per hit, which again, seems like a pretty big difference. This last hit here, 22,800. Again, pretty big difference at 5,000 per hit. But if we look at the numbers and we do the exact same calculations that we did in the first example, again, we can see that we did about 3,500 more damage without the buff. Now, I want to say a few more things about this, but before I do, I just want to give a shout out to my friend Tix6i9, because the idea for testing this weapon came directly from a conversation with him, so I have to give him credit for this idea. Finishing up on this info, I want to say that from reverse engineering the numbers, I came to the conclusion that the damage bonus from mid-potency magic attack up in my tests was roughly 20%. And if we assume that high potency would give us 30%, that's when we would start to see the shift to the buffed hits doing more overall damage. However, against non-weak elements, this only works out to being about 1,000 more damage over the course of your 4 hits, so keep that in mind if you're considering building a weapon like this. Something else to consider is that if you set up your Sephiroth with this weapon equipped, or anyone with this type of buff, the AI will prioritize casting the buff if you are controlling another character, and this will cause you to do overall less DPS unless you manage to get to high potency on a single cast. Hopefully this information in this video gave you some useful insights about buffs and debuffs so that you can make more strategic decisions about what weapons to build up and what to bring into fights. If you found it helpful, subscribe for future content. Thanks for watching.